He survived 2 world wars. He fought in North Africa, Sicily, France, and Germany. He was shot at, bombed, nearly captured, and court-martialed twice. German commanders feared him more than any other Allied general. His own government considered him the most dangerous man in Europe. And then, 8 months after the war ended, he was killed, if you believe the official story, by a slow-moving army truck on a quiet German road. No one else in the vehicle was seriously injured. There was no official investigation by military police. No autopsy was ever performed. The accident report vanished. And the man who spent his entire life rushing toward death, who once said he wanted to be killed by the last bullet in the last battle of the last war, died quietly in a hospital bed, paralyzed, alone, except for his wife, 12 days after a minor collision at less than 40 kilometers per hour. 34 years later, a former American spy stood up in front of 450 ex-intelligence operatives at a Washington hotel and told them he had been paid $10,000 to kill George Patton. Was it an accident? Was it a conspiracy? Was it the Soviets, the OSS, or something even closer to home? And why does the truth still matter 80 years later? This is the story of the death of General George S. Patton, and the question that has never been fully answered. To understand why someone might want George Patton dead, you first have to understand what George Patton was. He was born in 1885 into a family with a deep military tradition. Men who had fought in the American Civil War, in the Mexican-American War, in the Revolution. Patton absorbed the idea of soldiering as a sacred calling almost from childhood. He graduated from West Point in 1909, commanded tanks in the First World War, and spent the interwar years obsessively studying military history and the tactics of every general from Alexander the Great to Napoleon. By the time the Second World War began, Patton was already the most experienced tank commander in the United States Army. He proved it in North Africa in 1943, then in Sicily, then in the most spectacular tank campaign in American military history, the Third Army's breakout across France in the summer of 1944. In just 6 weeks, Patton's army advanced 600 miles, liberated enormous swathes of France, and shattered multiple German divisions in a campaign that military historians still study today. When the Germans launched their desperate Ardennes offensive in December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, and surrounded the American 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne, Patton did something that military planners had considered operationally impossible. He wheeled his entire army 90 degrees in winter conditions and drove north to relieve the siege in 48 hours. Military historians call it one of the greatest logistical feats in the history of warfare. But Patton's greatest strength was also his most dangerous liability. He did not think like a diplomat. He did not think like a politician. He thought like a soldier. And by the spring of 1945, the world was moving into an era where soldiers were supposed to stand down and the diplomats were supposed to take over. Patton had no interest in standing down. And what he was saying in the final months of his life was making very powerful people extremely uncomfortable. On May 7th, 1945, the day Germany surrendered, General Patton sat across from Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower and said something that would define the last 7 months of his life. He told Eisenhower they needed to fight the Soviet Union immediately. While American forces were intact, well supplied, and at peak combat strength. While the Red Army was exhausted from 4 years of devastating war on the Eastern Front, before the Soviets could consolidate their hold on Eastern Europe, Eisenhower, who had spent years carefully managing the alliance with Stalin that had made Allied victory possible, stared at his general and said, "The war is over." We are going home. Patton did not stop. Throughout the summer and autumn of 1945, he made his views known with increasing recklessness. In private conversations that were being wiretapped, in letters to his wife that would later be published, and eventually in press conferences that were reported around the world. He believed the United States and Britain had won the war, but were in the process of losing the peace. He believed Stalin was a greater threat than Hitler had been. He believed the rapid demobilization of the American army was a catastrophic mistake. In one wiretapped conversation, he told a fellow general that he could arrange enough incidents within 10 days to put the United States at war with the Soviet Union and make it look like the Soviets' fault. Washington was appalled. The American public still considered Stalin a wartime hero. The entire post-war international order, the United Nations, the occupation zones, the diplomatic settlements that had been negotiated at enormous political cost, depended on maintaining at least the appearance of cooperation with Moscow. Then, Patton made an even more catastrophic mistake. Asked about the denazification program, the Allied policy of removing former Nazi Party members from positions of authority in post-war Germany, Patton told reporters he did not see the point of it. Many of these people had only joined the Nazi Party for practical reasons, he said. It was no different from being a Democrat or Republican back home. The reaction was explosive. Newspapers across America reported that one of the war's most celebrated generals was defending Nazis. Eisenhower summoned Patton and ordered him to issue a correction. Patton repeated his original statements almost word for word. On September 28, 1945, Eisenhower relieved Patton of command of the Third Army, the force he had built, shaped, and led across Europe. He was given a meaningless administrative posting, overseeing the collection of Army historical records. Everyone understood it was a humiliation designed to silence him. It did not work. Patton continued writing letters to his wife, diary entries, and conversations with trusted aides that made clear he intended to retire from the Army, return to the United States, and make his views about the Soviet threat known publicly. He was scheduled to fly home in January 1946. He never made it. The morning of December 9, 1945, was cold and foggy near Mannheim, Germany. General Patton had accepted an invitation from his chief of staff, Major General Hobart Gay, to go pheasant hunting outside the base, one of the few pleasures still available to a man who felt his career was effectively over. Before they set off, there was a small incident. Patton's regular driver of 5 years, Sergeant Mims, was in hospital. A substitute driver named Private Horace Woodring was assigned. Patton noticed that the hunting party's guide had his dog riding in an open jeep behind them in the cold. He asked the column to stop, had the dog brought into their Cadillac and moved to the rear seat himself. It was an act of kindness toward an animal that, in retrospect, placed him in exactly the wrong position at exactly the wrong moment. At an intersection on the outskirts of Mannheim, an American Army 2.5-ton truck turned left across the path of Patton's Cadillac. The collision was at low speed. The Cadillac was traveling at around 30 to 40 kilometers per hour. It was, by any objective measure, a minor accident. The truck driver was uninjured. Driver Woodring was uninjured. General Gay, sitting right next to Patton in the rear seat, was completely uninjured. George Patton, thrown forward by the impact, struck the glass partition behind the front seats. The blow fractured his third cervical vertebra and dislocated the fourth on the fifth. He was paralyzed from the neck down instantly. He turned to Gay and said, "Work my fingers, Hap." When Gay rubbed them, Patton understood the implications immediately. "This is a hell of a way to die," he said. He was rushed to the 131st Station Hospital in Heidelberg, 12 miles away. His wife Beatrice flew from Boston to be at his bedside. Doctors applied spinal traction, metal fishhooks drilled into his cheekbones, attached to weights to stabilize his neck. He lay in a 14 by 16-foot former utility closet. For 12 days, paralyzed, encased in plaster, he fought to survive. On the morning of December 21st, he refused breakfast and told his nurse, "I am going to die." That evening, while Beatrice was at supper, a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot in his lung, reached his heart. By the time she ran back to his room, he was gone. He was 60 years old. Within days of Patton's death, rumors began circulating in military circles that the accident had not been an accident. Over the following decades, those rumors hardened into specific claims, and the specific claims hardened into a body of circumstantial evidence that, while not conclusive, has never been fully explained away. The first anomaly, the accident report, disappeared. Military Police Lieutenant Peter Babalis filed a report on the accident at the time. When he requested a copy of that report decades later, he was told it did not exist. No record of any official military investigation into the accident has ever been found. For a collision involving America's most famous active duty general, the absence of any formal investigation is, at minimum, unusual. The second anomaly, no autopsy was performed. Beatrice Patton refused the Army's request for an autopsy, and the Army did not press the matter. This meant that the cause of death, officially recorded as pulmonary embolism following spinal cord injury, was never independently verified. A pulmonary embolism leaves no visible trace in the body and cannot be distinguished from a poisoning that induces the same symptoms. The third anomaly, Patton's regular driver was absent. Sergeant Mims had been Patton's personal driver for 5 years. He knew Patton's habits, his routes, his timing. On the morning of December 9th, Mims was in hospital, replaced, at short notice, by a substitute who was unfamiliar with the general's preferences and movements. Conspiracy theorists have pointed to this as potentially significant. Defenders of the accident theory note that Mims genuinely was ill, and that substitute drivers are entirely routine. The fourth anomaly, only Patton was injured. In a collision at low speed between a Cadillac and a truck, in which both other passengers were completely uninjured, George Patton, who was sitting in the rear seat, struck a glass partition with sufficient force to shatter his spine. His biographer, Carlo Dieste, noted this inconsistency, though he ultimately concluded that it could be explained by Patton's particular position at the moment of impact and the angle of the collision. The fifth anomaly, Patton had experienced 3 other suspicious incidents in the preceding months. He had nearly been shot down in his aircraft. 2 weeks before the car accident, his Jeep had collided with an ox cart. Each incident, taken individually, was explainable as bad luck. Taken together, they gave some investigators pause. On the evening of September 25th, 1979, 34 years after Patton's death, a man stood up at a reunion dinner of former OSS operatives at the Washington Hilton Hotel and made one of the most extraordinary public statements in the history of American intelligence. His name was Douglas Bazata. He was 68 years old, a decorated former OSS Jedburgh, the most dangerous category of wartime operative, parachuted behind enemy lines to organize resistance against the Nazi occupation. He had won the Distinguished Service Cross, 4 Purple Hearts, and France's Croix de Guerre. After the war, he had become a painter, a flamboyant figure whose work was championed by the Duchess of Windsor and Princess Grace of Monaco, and who had once been painted as Don Quixote by Salvador Dalí himself. In front of 450 former colleagues, men who had killed for their country and carried decades of classified secrets, Bazata stood up and said, "I know who killed Patton. because I am the one who was hired to do it. $10,000. General William J. Wild Bill Donovan himself, director of the OSS, entrusted me with the mission. The room went very quiet. Over the following years, Bazata elaborated his account in interviews and in his personal diaries, which were later studied by author Robert K. Wilcox for his book, Target, Patton. According to Bazata's account, he was approached by Donovan in 1945 with orders that came from higher authority. He implied the White House itself. Patton was considered a threat to the post-war diplomatic order. His anti-Soviet statements, his plan to go public after leaving the military, his intention to potentially run for office, all of it was judged too dangerous at a moment when American foreign policy depended on maintaining working relations with Stalin. Bazata claimed he was present at the scene of the accident on December 9th. He claimed he had informants inside Patton's headquarters who gave him details of the general's planned movements. He claimed that after following Patton's Cadillac, he fired a low-velocity projectile into the back of Patton's neck at the moment of the collision, a specially designed weapon intended to break bones without leaving a bullet behind, making the injury appear consistent with a car crash. When Patton survived the initial attack, paralyzed but alive, Bazata claimed that Soviet NKVD agents working with elements of the OSS administered an untraceable cyanide compound to Patton in the hospital. A compound made in Czechoslovakia, he said, designed to cause pulmonary embolism or heart failure over 18 to 48 hours, leaving no detectable trace. Bazata repeated this account multiple times until his death in 1999. He never recanted. He is buried in Arlington National Cemetery. Most professional historians who have examined the evidence conclude that Patton's death was an accident, and their reasons are worth taking seriously. The most fundamental problem with Bazata's account is that it is almost entirely uncorroborated. No other witness places him at the scene. No physical evidence of a low-velocity projectile was ever found, and surely, doctors treating Patton at the 131st Station Hospital would have noticed an additional wound. Major General Hobart Gay, who was sitting directly next to Patton at the moment of the collision and was completely uninjured, never reported seeing any shooter or any second vehicle. Driver Woodring, equally uninjured and equally present, made no such claim either. Bazata's story also changed. In some versions, he personally fired the shot. In others, he was present, but someone else did the actual shooting. In others still, he was asked to do it, but refused. His diaries contain all three versions. For a man who claimed to remember the operation in precise detail, the inconsistency is difficult to explain. There is also the awkward matter of timing. Bazata claimed he had informants inside Patton's headquarters who told him about the December 9th hunting trip in advance. But the trip was only arranged that morning, when General Keyes, who had been expected to visit Patton, was unexpectedly called back to his own headquarters early. Only at that point did Gay and Patton decide to go hunting. The window between the decision and the departure would have been extremely short. Too short, critics argue, for Bazata to have positioned himself and a co-conspirator at the right intersection. The medical evidence also largely supports the accident. A 2008 paper published in the Journal of Neurosurgery reviewed Patton's medical records in detail and concluded that his injuries were entirely consistent with the mechanism described: a forward impact against a glass partition in a vehicle collision. The fracture pattern, the level of the injury, and the subsequent development of pulmonary embolism, a well-documented and tragically common complication of prolonged immobility following spinal cord injury, all fit the official account. Patton's own biographer, Carlo D'Este, who spent years examining every available document and interviewing surviving witnesses, concluded bluntly, "Those who suggest Patton was murdered have failed to provide the slightest evidence of how anyone could have planned such an operation or ensured that the collision would happen at that specific moment and place." So, was General George S. Patton assassinated? The honest answer, the historically responsible answer, is that we do not know, and we may never know. The weight of credible historical evidence points toward accident. The medical facts are consistent with an accidental death. The key eyewitnesses reported no evidence of foul play. The main source for the assassination theory is a single man whose account contradicted itself and who had documented reasons to want to damage the reputation of the OSS. But, and this is the part that keeps the question alive, the circumstantial context is genuinely extraordinary. Patton was the most outspoken anti-Soviet voice in the American military at the moment when American foreign policy most needed quiet. He was weeks away from retiring and making his views public. He had explicitly told colleagues he intended to speak out. His phones were tapped. His residence was bugged. The people he was criticizing, Eisenhower, Donovan, the architects of the post-war settlement, had both motive and means. The missing accident report has never been found. The absence of an autopsy means the official cause of death was never independently verified. And the single most important fact in the entire story, that Douglas Bazata, a highly trained and decorated American intelligence operative, publicly confessed to killing Patton in front of 450 witnesses and never recanted, has never been satisfactorily explained. Either he was lying for attention and money, which is entirely possible, or he was telling the truth, which changes everything we think we know about the end of the Second World War. George Patton is buried in Luxembourg at the American Cemetery at Ham, surrounded by the soldiers of his Third Army who died in the Battle of the Bulge. He asked to be buried with his men. It was the most Patton thing he ever did. Whether he was killed by a truck, by an embolism, by a bullet, or by a conspiracy, he remains what he was when he was alive: the most complicated, the most brilliant, and the most dangerous American general of the Second World War. History is full of questions that may never be answered. The death of George Patton is one of them. The evidence points in different directions. The witnesses are gone. The documents, at least some of them, have disappeared. What we know for certain is this: a man who survived every battlefield of 2 world wars, who was feared by the enemy and inconvenient to his allies, who was planning to come home and tell the world what he had seen, died in a small hospital room in Germany on December 21, 1945, 12 days after a low-speed collision that injured no one else. Was it an accident? Probably. Was it murder? Possibly. Will we ever know for certain? Almost certainly not. But the question itself matters, because it forces us to ask what kind of world was being built in the ruins of 1945, and what kind of men were building it, and whether the most honest soldier of his generation was allowed to live long enough to say what he knew. If this story made you think, subscribe for more hidden histories from inside the Second World War, and let us know in the comments. Do you believe Patton was assassinated? Or was it just a terrible accident? The debate is still very much open.